Howdy. So today we'll be talking about Jacques Cartier's first voyage. His first voyage to the Americas is hard to process. First of all, there's very little information, a few pages worth of diary entries for an entire summer. Yet what Cartier reveals about his own thoughts and actions is damning evidence against what we today consider civility and progress. In other words, Cartier felt entitled to everything he could put his hands on. Him and his crew killed over 5 tons of birds and a polar bear as soon as they got to the other side of the Atlantic. He then called the natives hostile savages, even if his own behavior would have earned him prison and death back home. He feared being treated as he treated the natives, with violence and disdain, and so lied to them about the nature of the cross he was putting up at the entrance of a bay. Violence wasn't there yet. It would come later on. It was a symbol of ownership in the name of God and King, but Cartier told them it was just a waypoint. There's a deliberate omission of information because Cartier doesn't think of them as actual people. He would have gladly dealt with them as he had dealt with the thousands of nesting birds he'd massacred, but he simply didn't have the firepower. There is a certain irony in the fear and disdain that Cartier had of natives. He knew full well that he couldn't claim their homeland as his own outright, yet still feels confident that he had a right to do so, even as he lied to them about the natures of his actions. When he's writing in his diary, the natives are exotic savages devoid of reason and order, but when it's time to deal with them, he acts as if he considered them his equal, which we know he doesn't. Accepting all their gifts, giving them metal in exchange, and directly prodding them for knowledge of a way, indirectly prodding them for a way to India, which is his main objectives. Because Cartier is so confident in his superiority, he feels no shame decimating local wildlife and befriending natives with false sympathy. Not to mention that the cross he puts up was once represented the suffering of a man-god whose whole life teachings amount to love thy neighbor. There are so many contradictions between the man's words and his actions that become evident that there are ulterior motives involved. The conquest of America is only manifest destiny because greedy people require a cover under which to operate. Otherwise, they get killed. Arrogance leads a man to foolishness, and Cartier was nothing if not arrogant. It's no wonder he taught himself somewhere close to the eastern shores of India. In the end, Cartier didn't claim the land because he had a right to do so. He did it because he thought it would benefit his own career. He would be the new Columbus or the new Verrazzano, whose voyages to Central America and South America were published and popular with the nobility in Spain. He would be greater than Verrazzano, no matter how many millions of living beings he killed. His status was more important to him than all of life in the New World, which essentially sets a precedent for how modern nations establish foreign policy today. Ultimately, however, publications of voyages to the New World will never be popular in France as in Spain, Britain, Italy, or the Netherlands. Cartier would never gain as much recognition as other great explorers, quote-unquote, who would basically bring the same self-entitled arrogance elsewhere for other kings, yet oddly enough, all for the same God. It appears the Christian God really likes people divided and competing for his attention, all in the name of a united church. See the contradictions piling up. Cartier uses the name of God and King as psychological shields against the many crimes he commits against nature and humanity. He does not need to think things through or have a conscience or be personally responsible for his actions because the powers that he is subservient to, in their greed, encourage his own. Is it any wonder that this same mentality is how society functions today? Case in point, the studies of Cartier's voyages, or other explorers, are chock full of language that glorifies everything he does while demonizing the natives. The most comprehensive memoirs of Cartier's life, written in 1906, starts out by stating, "The early history of Canada, which we know to have been full of romantic interest, has been strangely neglected by the French, who do not seem to have regarded the discoveries and adventures of their brave countrymen, who so nobly strove to secure a magnificent domain for their fatherland as of sufficient importance to demand particular attention. So the very first sentence of the memoirs fall victims to a self-fulfilling prophecy. The author is quite heavily imposing the romance that he perceives onto actions and behaviors that are in fact sociopathic and genocidal in nature. The author is adding unnecessary adjectives to every description of events in order to see things how he wants to see them. History hasn't been strangely neglected by the French. It's simply understood and so valued differently. So the countrymen of the French weren't brave for searching for a magnificent increase in the king's possessions. For Cartier, it was a means to boost his own status, and for his crew, it was a means of getting paid and not getting harassed by the crown. Human beings have the same motivations then that they have today. Or they have the same motivations today that they have then. We must remember that Cartier's crew were forcibly put together and that the seamen weren't so keen on the voyage, preferring instead to fish or trade, which offered steady pay and much less risk. Their noble efforts were coerced. No one was there to claim for land for their country. Nationalism wasn't even around yet, so they would have claimed for God and King if they did, but they didn't. If anything, claiming possession of the land was an afterthought behind finding a route to India, which we know to be so incredibly misguided that I wonder how anyone, especially a scholar, can glorify and romanticize such ignorance and foolishness as some sort of noble bravery. There were already people living in the New World, which meant that it wasn't new, not to mention that Vikings had already made the trip hundreds of years earlier, representing Europeans. So what is so great about what Cartier did? Basically, he made it possible for Europeans' descendants to survive from the exploitation of natives and the resulting immigrant labor all over the world. Same for other explorers. They set a precedent. Justifying behavior seen in the past is useful when trying to maintain a status quo that depends on continued genocide and immigration due to genocide to function. We still exploit and kill anyone of non-European descent, and even then, virtually every European nationality hate each other. While this author sees romance, I see attempts at justifying genocide. In the end, Cartier comes back to France with the remains of his skills and 2 Micmac natives which he plans to use to get through the other natives and so to India. Again, Cartier's greed would guide his actions and prevent him from simply asking whether this was possible to his 2 interpreters. What would he care what they had to say? He simply needed them to speak French because he sure wouldn't be learning to speak their tongue. Again, we see the sheer arrogance that Cartier held. When he returned to France and explained himself to the king, Cartier would then be fitted by the crown for a new voyage, planning this time to spend the winter overseas, which will reveal to us ever more of Cartier's sociopathic behavior.